Have you ever noticed how some weeks feel like everything is conspiring against you? How a single spilled coffee seems to trigger a cascade where everything goes wrong, and you can't help but think, maybe it's me, maybe I'm the problem. But what if this feeling isn't about what's happening to you, but about how you're seeing it? What if your mind has been quietly rewriting reality, filtering every experience through a lens so distorted that you've forgotten what clarity feels like? This is how depression operates, not by making bad things happen, but by convincing you that everything is bad, that you are bad, that nothing will ever change. If this reflects you, subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything. Now, let's start story. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones when you've been trying for too long and nothing seems to work. It's not the tiredness that comes from physical effort or lack of sleep. It's deeper than that, more corrosive. It's the fatigue of watching yourself fail repeatedly, feeling like you're moving through life with invisible weights attached to your ankles, while everyone else seems to glide forward effortlessly. You wake up, and the first thought that arrives, uninvited and unwelcome, is a quiet resignation that today will probably be another day where things don't go the way you hoped. And what makes it worse, what makes it truly unbearable, is that you can't even pinpoint exactly what's going wrong. It's not one catastrophic event. It's 1,000 small disappointments that accumulate like dust until you can barely see through the haze of your own frustration. The message you sent that never got a response. The project you poured yourself into that went unnoticed. The conversation where you said something slightly off and spent the next 3 hours dissecting every word, every facial expression, every micro moment where you might have revealed too much or not enough. And somewhere in the middle of all this, a question begins to form. Quiet at first, then louder, more insistent. Why does everything feel so hard? Why do other people seem to navigate the same world with ease, while you're constantly stumbling, constantly second-guessing, constantly bracing for the next thing to go wrong? What most people don't realize? What you probably don't realize, even as you're living through it, is that this feeling isn't random. It's not bad luck. It's not the universe conspiring against you, though it certainly feels that way. What's actually happening is far more subtle and far more devastating. When you're caught in the grip of depression, your mind doesn't just make you feel worse. It reconstructs reality itself. It takes the raw data of your life, all the neutral events and ambiguous moments and small interactions that make up a day, and it filters them through a lens so distorted that by the time they reach your conscious awareness, they've been transformed into evidence of your inadequacy. And the truly insidious part, the part that makes this so difficult to recognize, is that this process happens automatically beneath the level of conscious thought. You don't choose to interpret things negatively. You don't decide to focus on what went wrong and ignore what went right. It simply happens as naturally as breathing, and with such consistency that you begin to believe this skewed version of reality is the only version that exists. The lens through which you see the world when you're depressed is not neutral. It's not objective. It's systematically biased toward finding problems, detecting threats, and confirming the worst possible interpretation of any given situation. Psychologists have spent decades studying this phenomenon, trying to understand why the depressed mind operates this way. why it seems so determined to make you suffer. And what they've discovered is that depression doesn't just alter your mood. It rewires the fundamental mechanisms of perception and cognition. Your attention narrows. Your memory becomes selective. Your predictions about the future grow increasingly pessimistic. And all of this happens in a way that feels completely rational, completely justified, completely true. You're not imagining that things are going wrong. From where you're standing, with the lens you're looking through, things genuinely are going wrong. The problem is that the lens itself is broken, and you've been staring through it for so long that you've forgotten what clear vision feels like. Think about the last time something didn't go the way you planned. Maybe it was a small thing, inconsequential in the grand scheme of your life. You forgot an appointment. You made a mistake at work. You reached out to someone and they didn't respond the way you hoped. Now notice what happened next in your mind. Did you think, well, that's unfortunate, but these things happen and tomorrow is another day? Or did your mind immediately leap to something darker, something more totalizing? Did you think, of course this happened because nothing ever works out for me, because I'm fundamentally incapable of getting things right, because there's something wrong with me that other people can see, but I can't fix? That leap, that instant escalation from a single disappointment to a sweeping condemnation of your entire existence, that's not logical thinking. That's not accurate assessment. That's the depression talking. And it's following a very specific script, one that's been running in the background of your mind for so long that you've started to believe it's your own voice. The cruel efficiency of depression lies in its ability to make you complicit in your own suffering. It doesn't feel like an external force attacking you. It feels like insight, like finally seeing the truth about yourself that you've been avoiding. When the thought arrives that you're not good enough, it doesn't announce itself as a symptom of illness. It presents itself as an observation, a conclusion based on evidence, a rational response to the facts of your life. And because it feels so true, because it arrives with such certainty and such force, you don't question it. You accept it. You internalize it. You begin to organize your entire sense of self around it. And once that happens, once you've accepted the premise that you're somehow fundamentally flawed, everything else follows with terrible logic. Of course, opportunities slip away because someone like you doesn't deserve them. Of course, people keep their distance because you're too much, too needy, too broken. Of course, the future looks bleak because how could someone like you ever build something good? But here's what needs to be said, what needs to be understood before we go any further into this examination of how depression operates. That voice, the one that sounds so much like truth, the one that catalogues your failures and predicts your future disappointments with such confidence, that voice is lying to you. Not in the sense that you're making things up or being dramatic or seeking attention. The lie is more fundamental than that. The lie is in the structure itself, in the way information is being processed, in the lens through which you're being forced to see. Depression isn't giving you clarity. It's giving you a distortion so consistent, so totalizing, that it creates its own kind of reality. And the most dangerous part is that this distorted reality doesn't stay confined to your thoughts. It begins to shape your actions, your choices, the way you move through the world. And those actions, in turn, create real consequences that seem to confirm what the depression has been telling you all along. This is the trap. This is the machinery of despair. And understanding how it works, seeing it clearly for what it is the first step toward finding your way out. There's a particular moment that happens when depression has fully settled into your mind, and it's so subtle that you might not even notice when it occurs. It's the moment when you stop questioning the narrative. You stop wondering if maybe, possibly, your perception might be skewed. You stop considering that there might be another way to interpret what's happening to you. Instead, you simply accept that this is how things are, how they've always been, and how they'll continue to be. The thoughts that flood your mind every morning, the predictions that arrive unbidden throughout the day, the conclusions you draw about yourself and your place in the world, all of it stops feeling like interpretation and starts feeling like fact. And once you've crossed that threshold, once you've stopped distinguishing between what you think and what is actually true, the depression has achieved something far more powerful than just making you feel bad. It has convinced you that your suffering is not a symptom, but a reasonable response to reality. What's happening in your mind during this process is something that cognitive researchers have mapped with uncomfortable precision. Your brain, that magnificent organ that's supposed to help you navigate the world and make sense of experience, has begun operating according to a set of rules that guarantee misery. And the truly maddening part is that these rules feel protective, like they're helping you avoid disappointment or prepare for inevitable failure. Your mind tells you not to hope too much, because hoping leads to devastation. It tells you not to try too hard, because trying and failing is worse than never trying at all. It tells you to expect rejection, to anticipate disappointment, to brace yourself for the moment when things inevitably fall apart. And in some twisted way, this feels like wisdom. It feels like you're finally being realistic, finally seeing through the naive optimism that other people cling to, finally accepting the harsh truths that everyone else is too comfortable to acknowledge. But this isn't wisdom. This isn't realism. This is a systematic distortion of probability, of possibility, of what your life actually contains. The mechanism behind this distortion operates on multiple levels simultaneously, and each level reinforces the others until you're trapped in a system that feeds on itself. It starts with attention. Right now, in this moment, there are thousands of pieces of information available to your consciousness. Sounds, sensations, memories, possibilities. Things you could notice if you chose to direct your awareness toward them. But your attention is not neutral. It's not scanning the environment objectively and reporting back what it finds. Your attention is being directed, narrowed, focused on a very specific subset of available information. And when you're depressed, that subset is overwhelmingly negative. Your mind becomes exquisitely sensitive to anything that might represent threat, failure, rejection, or loss. A slight change in someone's tone of voice becomes evidence that they're annoyed with you. A task that takes longer than expected becomes proof that you're incompetent. A moment of fatigue becomes a sign that you're broken, that your body is giving up on you the same way you've given up on yourself. Meanwhile, the neutral moments, the small successes, the times when things actually worked out fine, all of that gets filtered out, dismissed as irrelevant or unrepresentative, forgotten almost as soon as it happens. This selective attention creates a distorted data set, and your mind then uses that distorted data to draw conclusions about yourself and your life. Imagine trying to understand what a city is like by only visiting it during storms, during traffic jams, during moments of chaos and dysfunction. You would come away with a very specific impression, and that impression would feel true because it's based on real observations. But it wouldn't be accurate because you've only been shown a fraction of what exists. Depression does this with your entire life. It curates your experience so carefully, so consistently, that you genuinely believe you're seeing the whole picture, when in fact, you're only seeing the parts that confirm what the depression needs you to believe. And what depression needs you to believe is that you are inadequate, that the world is hostile or indifferent, and that the future holds nothing but more of the same suffering you're experiencing right now. But the distortion doesn't stop with attention. Once you've noticed something negative, once it's entered your awareness, your memory takes over and the distortion deepens. Memory is not a video recording. It's not an objective archive of everything that's happened to you. Memory is reconstructive, which means that every time you recall something, you're rebuilding it from fragments. And in that rebuilding process, details get added, emphasized, or erased based on your current emotional state and beliefs. When you're depressed, your memory becomes a weapon turned against yourself. You remember failures with crystal clarity, every detail sharp and vivid and painful. But successes become hazy, questionable, easy to dismiss. You remember the criticism you received, but forget the praise. You remember the time you embarrassed yourself, but not the 100 times you navigated social situations just fine. Your mind keeps a meticulous record of every mistake, every disappointment, every moment that supports the narrative of your inadequacy, while quietly erasing the evidence that might contradict it. And the longer this goes on, the more your past gets rewritten, until your entire history feels like one long string of failures, leading inevitably to this moment of despair. Then there's the future, which might be where depression does its most devastating work. Because at least with the past and present, there's some external reality to push against, or some actual events that occurred or are occurring that could theoretically be verified or examined. But the future doesn't exist yet. The future is pure imagination, pure prediction. And when you're depressed, your predictions take on a weight and certainty that crushes any possibility of hope. You don't just think things might go wrong. You know they will. You can see it so clearly, the inevitable disappointment, the moment when your efforts prove insufficient, the rejection that's coming, the failure that's waiting. And because these predictions feel so real, so certain, you start making decisions based on them. You don't apply for the job because you already know you won't get it. You don't reach out to the person because you already know they don't want to hear from you. You don't start the project because you already know it won't turn out the way you want. And here's the truly diabolical part of this mechanism. By acting on these predictions, by organizing your behavior around the certainty of negative outcomes, you actually increase the likelihood that those outcomes will occur. This is where thought becomes action, and action begins to shape reality in ways that validate the original distorted thoughts. If you believe no one wants to spend time with you, you withdraw. And when you withdraw, people stop reaching out because they assume you want space, or they get tired of being rejected. And then you look at your isolation and think, see, I was right. No one cares. But what actually happened? Depression fed you a prediction. You acted on that prediction, and your actions created the very outcome you were trying to avoid. The same pattern plays out across every domain of life. Predict failure, give up early, experience failure. Use that failure as proof that the original prediction was accurate. Predict rejection, protect yourself by rejecting first or never trying. Experience loneliness. Use that loneliness as evidence that you were right to protect yourself. The loop tightens. The system becomes self-sustaining. And from inside this loop, it's almost impossible to see that you're not simply observing reality, but actively constructing a reality that matches what depression has taught you to expect. And the more this happens, the more solid the prison becomes, until you can't even remember what it felt like to see clearly, to move freely, to believe that something different might be possible. There's something you need to understand about the thoughts that run through your mind when you're depressed, something that changes everything once you see it clearly. These thoughts don't feel like thoughts at all. They feel like facts. They arrive with such speed, such certainty, such authority, that you don't recognize them as interpretations or judgments or predictions. You experience them as direct perceptions of reality, as obvious truths that don't require examination or questioning. Someone walks past you without smiling, and the thought arrives instantly. They think I'm worthless, and it doesn't feel like a thought. It feels like information, like something you just know the same way you know the sky is above you and the ground is beneath your feet. This is what makes depression so difficult to escape. You're not just fighting against painful emotions. You're fighting against what feels like reality itself. The technical term for these lightning-fast judgments is automatic thoughts. And they're called automatic because they happen without conscious effort, without deliberate intention, without you having any say in whether they appear or not. They just arrive fully formed, and they arrive constantly, hundreds of them throughout the day, a running commentary on everything you do and everything that happens to you. And when you're depressed, this commentary is relentlessly, mercilessly negative. You look in the mirror and the thought appears. You look terrible. Everyone can see how broken you are. You sit down to work, and before you've even started, the voice announces, "You won't be able to do this. You never finish anything." You think about calling a friend, and immediately the thought intercepts you. They don't actually want to hear from you. You're being a burden. These aren't careful assessments based on evidence. These aren't conclusions you've arrived at through reasoning. These are reflexes, mental habits that have been carved so deeply into your neural pathways that they've become your default mode of processing the world. What makes automatic thoughts so powerful, so destructive, is not just their content, but their invisibility. Most of the time, you don't even notice you're having them. They operate at the edge of awareness, shaping your emotional responses and guiding your behavior without ever fully entering consciousness. You just feel the result. You feel anxious, but you don't catch the thought that triggered the anxiety. You feel worthless, but you don't notice the series of judgments your mind made in the seconds before that feeling arrived. You feel hopeless, but you're not aware of the predictions your brain just generated about how the next hour, the next day, the next year will unfold. And because you're not catching these thoughts, because they're happening too fast and too automatically to be examined, you have no opportunity to question them, to test them against reality, to consider whether they might be distortions rather than facts. They just become the invisible architecture of your suffering, the unseen machinery that keeps you trapped. But here's what happens when you start paying attention. When you slow down enough to actually catch these thoughts in the moment they appear, you begin to notice something strange, something that should probably alarm you more than it does. These thoughts follow patterns. They repeat themselves. They use the same language, the same absolutist phrases, the same catastrophic logic over and over again. Always, never, everyone, no one, completely, totally, forever. Words that allow no room for nuance, no space for exceptions, no possibility of things being complicated or mixed or somewhere in the middle. You start to see that your mind is not giving you objective information about your life. It's running a program, executing a script that was written long ago, and that plays regardless of what's actually happening in front of you. The same thought that appeared when you made a small mistake at work is the exact same thought that appeared when you forgot someone's birthday. And it's the same thought that will appear the next time anything goes even slightly wrong. I'm a failure. I ruin everything. I'm not capable of being a functional person. The circumstances change, but the conclusion never does, which should tell you something important about whether this conclusion is actually based on circumstances or whether it's something else entirely. When you examine these automatic thoughts closely, when you write them down and look at them as sentences on a page, rather than just experiencing them as emotional weather, you start to see how distorted they really are. Take the thought, "Nobody likes me." If you sat down and actually tested this thought against reality, you would immediately encounter problems. Nobody? Not a single person? Not your family? Not one friend? Not one colleague? Not one person you've ever met in your entire life? The thought claims absolute knowledge of what every person thinks about you, which is obviously impossible. But when the thought arrives automatically, when it hits you as a feeling rather than a statement, you don't notice the absurdity of the claim. You just feel the loneliness it produces, and that feeling becomes evidence that the thought must be true. Or consider the thought, "I always mess things up." Always? Every single time? Every task you've ever attempted in your entire life has ended in failure. You're reading these words right now, which means you successfully learned to read at some point, which means there's at least one thing you didn't mess up. But the automatic thought doesn't care about evidence. It's not interested in accuracy. It's interested in maintaining the narrative that depression needs you to believe. The patterns these thoughts follow are not random. Researchers have identified specific types of distortions that show up again and again in the automatic thoughts of depressed individuals. And once you learn to recognize these distortions, you can't unsee them. There's all or nothing thinking, where everything is either perfect or a complete disaster with no middle ground. There's catastrophizing, where a minor setback immediately becomes proof that your entire life is falling apart. There's personalization, where you take responsibility for things that have nothing to do with you, assuming that if something went wrong, it must be your fault. There's mind reading, where you claim to know what others are thinking about you, despite having no actual evidence. There's fortune telling, where you predict negative outcomes with absolute certainty, and then act as if those predictions are already reality. Each of these distortions has its own signature, its own particular way of bending reality, until it matches what depression needs you to see. And the truly unsettling part is that these distortions feel completely rational when you're experiencing them. Your mind presents them with such confidence, such authority, that questioning them feels like denying reality rather than examining it. But something shifts when you start catching these thoughts, when you begin to see them as thoughts rather than as truth. You create distance. You create space between the thought and your reaction to it. And in that space, something becomes possible that wasn't possible before. You can ask questions. You can look for evidence. You can wonder whether there might be other ways to interpret what's happening. This doesn't mean the thoughts stop appearing. They're automatic. Remember, they're habits. And habits don't disappear just because you've noticed them. But when you can see them for what they are, when you can recognize the distortion patterns they follow, they lose some of their power. They stop being reality and start being something you're experiencing, something you can observe and evaluate, rather than something you're trapped inside. And that shift, small as it might seem, is the beginning of everything changing. Because once you realize that your thoughts are not facts, that your mind has been running a distorted program rather than reporting objective truth, the entire structure of depression becomes visible. And what's visible can be examined. What can be examined can be challenged. And what can be challenged can eventually be changed. The moment you start to see your thoughts as distorted, as patterns running on repeat rather than accurate reflections of reality, something else begins to reveal itself. Something that might be even more important to understand. Depression doesn't just live in your mind. It doesn't stay confined to the realm of thoughts and feelings and perceptions. Depression moves through your body, into your behavior, into the concrete choices you make every single day. And this is where the trap becomes truly sophisticated, because the behaviors that depression encourages, the actions it pushes you toward or pulls you away from, these behaviors create real consequences in the actual world. They generate evidence. They produce outcomes. And those outcomes feed directly back into the distorted thoughts, confirming them, solidifying them, making them feel more true than ever before. Think about what happens when depression tells you that reaching out to people is pointless, that nobody really wants to hear from you, that you're just bothering them with your presence. You feel this as a heavy certainty, and that certainty influences what you do next. You don't send the message. You don't make the call. You cancel the plans. You decline the invitation. And in the moment, this feels like self-protection, like you're saving yourself from the inevitable rejection or the exhausting effort of pretending to be okay. But what actually happens over time? The people in your life start to drift away, not because they don't care, but because you've created distance, because you've sent a clear signal that you want to be left alone. And then weeks pass, maybe months, and you look around at your isolation, and the thought returns with even more force. See, nobody reaches out anymore. I was right. I don't matter to anyone. But this conclusion erases the entire chain of events that led here. It erases all the times you pulled away, all the invitations you refused, all the connections you severed, because depression convinced you they were already broken. This is the machinery of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it operates across every dimension of life with devastating efficiency. Depression tells you that effort is futile, that trying doesn't matter because you'll fail anyway, so why bother? And that thought, that prediction, directly shapes what you do. You procrastinate. You give up before you've really started. You put in half-hearted effort because some part of you is already convinced the outcome is predetermined. And then, when things don't work out, when the project falls apart, or the opportunity slips away, or the goal remains unmet, you don't see the connection between your diminished effort and the disappointing result. You only see confirmation of what you already believed. I can't do anything right. I'm incapable. Nothing works for me. The thought predicted failure. The behavior ensured failure, and the failure proved the thought was accurate. The loop closes. The system reinforces itself. And you become more convinced than ever that the problem is something fundamental about who you are, rather than something about how you're operating. What makes this pattern so difficult to break is that the behaviors feel necessary, feel like the only reasonable response to how you're feeling. When you're exhausted, when every small task feels like climbing a mountain, when your mind is screaming at you that you're inadequate and everything is pointless, of course you withdraw. Of course you stop trying. Of course you choose the path of least resistance, the option that requires the least energy, the choice that protects you from additional disappointment. These behaviors make sense given the internal experience you're having. The problem is that they don't make sense given the reality of what's actually possible. They're logical responses to a distorted perception, which means they're ultimately illogical responses to reality itself. And every time you act based on the distortion rather than the reality, you make the distortion more powerful, more convincing, harder to escape. There's a particular kind of behavior that depression specializes in encouraging, and it's one of the most destructive because it feels so much like wisdom. It's the behavior of quitting before you can be rejected, failing before you can be judged, ending things before they can end badly. You don't apply for the position because then you can't be turned down. You don't start the creative project because then you can't produce something mediocre. You don't get close to anyone because then you can't be abandoned. And in some twisted way, this feels like control. It feels like you're protecting yourself, like you're making strategic choices based on accurate predictions about how things would go. But what you're actually doing is guaranteeing the very outcomes you're afraid of. You wanted to avoid rejection, so you rejected yourself first. You wanted to avoid failure, so you engineered failure before anyone else could witness it. You wanted to avoid abandonment, so you abandoned the possibility of connection before it could even begin. And then you live in the aftermath of these preemptive strikes against yourself and feel their weight as proof that your fears were justified, that your predictions were accurate, that depression was telling you the truth all along. The behaviors that depression generates also extend into how you treat yourself, how you care for your body and your space and your basic needs. When you're convinced that you don't matter, that your suffering is deserved, that there's no point in trying to feel better, you stop doing the small things that maintain well-being. You stop eating regularly, or you eat without thought or care. You stop moving your body. You let your living space descend into chaos because cleaning feels impossible. And why does it matter anyway when everything is already falling apart? You skip sleep or sleep too much. You ignore physical pain. You let responsibilities pile up until they become genuinely overwhelming. And each of these forms of neglect creates real problems, real discomfort, real dysfunction in your life. Your body feels worse because you're not caring for it. Your environment feels oppressive because it's cluttered and dirty. Your obligations become actually unmanageable because you've let them accumulate beyond what anyone could reasonably handle. And then Depression looks at all of this, at the very real mess that now surrounds you, and it says, "See, look at your life. Look at what a disaster you are." But it doesn't show you how it orchestrated this disaster, how it talked you into every act of neglect, how it convinced you that you weren't worth caring for in the first place. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of these behavioral patterns is how they create evidence that feels objective, that feels like it exists independently of your thoughts and feelings. When someone points out that your thoughts might be distorted, you can gesture at your actual life and say, "But look at the state of things. Look at what I've lost. Look at what I haven't achieved. Look at how alone I am." These are facts. This is reality. And yes, they are facts. They are reality. But they're facts and reality that were shaped by behaviors. And those behaviors were shaped by distorted thoughts. And those thoughts were shaped by depression. The whole system is circular, feeding on itself, using its own outputs as inputs, generating more and more evidence for the fundamental lie at its center. And the longer this continues, the harder it becomes to see where the circle began, to trace the chain back to its origin, to recognize that what feels like truth about who you are is actually the end result of a process that started with distortion and compounded through action. But here's what needs to be understood. What might be the most important thing to grasp about this entire mechanism? If behavior can worsen depression, if actions based on distorted thoughts can create real consequences that reinforce those thoughts, then behavior can also be the way out. Not thinking different thoughts, not waiting to feel motivated, not hoping that one day you'll wake up and everything will suddenly be easier, but acting differently, moving differently, making different choices, even when everything in you is screaming that those choices are pointless. Because behavior is the hinge between the internal world of thoughts and feelings and the external world of consequences and outcomes. And if you can change what you do, even slightly, even in ways that feel insignificant, you can begin to change what happens. And when what happens changes, the thoughts have less to hold on to, less evidence to cite, less power to convince you that they're telling you the truth. There comes a point in understanding depression where knowledge alone stops being enough. You can see the distortions clearly now. You can recognize the automatic thoughts as they appear. You can trace the connections between what you think, how you feel, and what you do. You understand the system, the machinery, the way depression constructs its own evidence, and then uses that evidence to justify its continued existence. But understanding doesn't automatically translate into change. You can know intellectually that your thoughts are distorted and still feel their weight pressing down on you with the same crushing force. You can recognize that your behaviors are reinforcing the cycle and still find yourself repeating them, because in the moment, doing anything different feels impossible. This is the gap that so many people get trapped in. The space between seeing the problem and actually being able to do something about it. And if you're in that gap right now, if you're thinking that all of this makes sense, but you still don't know how to move forward, that's not a failure on your part. That's just where the real work begins. The shift that needs to happen is not primarily a shift in thinking. That might sound strange given everything we've explored about distorted thoughts and cognitive patterns. But here's the truth that gets missed in a lot of discussions about depression. You cannot think your way out of depression. You cannot reason with it, argue with it, or convince it to leave through the sheer force of logic. Depression is not a debate that you can win. It's a system, and systems change through intervention at multiple points simultaneously, through sustained pressure applied consistently over time. And one of the most powerful points of intervention, one of the most accessible levers you have available to you right now, regardless of how you feel, is your behavior. Not what you think, not what you believe, not how motivated or hopeful or confident you are. Just what you do. The physical actions you take. The choices you make about how to spend the next 5 minutes, the next hour, the next day. This is where something called behavioral activation becomes essential, and it operates on a principle that runs counter to everything depression has taught you about how change works. Depression tells you that you need to feel better before you can act better, that you need to wait for motivation to arrive, that you need to be in the right mental state before you can do anything productive or meaningful. It says, when I feel less tired, then I'll start exercising. When I feel more confident, then I'll reach out to people. When I feel like myself again, then I'll start taking care of things. But this is another lie, another trap. Because if you wait to feel better before acting differently, you will wait forever. The feelings don't change on their own. They change in response to what you do, in response to evidence that accumulates through action, through engagement with the world, through experiences that contradict what depression has been telling you. This means you have to act first, before you feel ready, before it feels natural, before you believe it will make any difference. You have to move toward life, even when life feels pointless. You have to engage even when engagement feels exhausting. You have to start impossibly small and trust that small actions accumulate into something larger than themselves. What impossibly small means is important to understand, because depression will try to sabotage you here too. It will look at the suggestion that you start small and immediately escalate the expectation until starting feels overwhelming again. It will say, small doesn't matter, small won't change anything. What difference does it make if you wash one dish, or go for a 5-minute walk, or send one message? But this is exactly the kind of all-or-nothing thinking we've been examining. Either you transform your entire life, or there's no point in trying. Either you fix everything at once, or nothing counts. This is the thinking that keeps you paralyzed. The truth that depression doesn't want you to discover is that small actions are not just better than nothing. They are fundamentally different from nothing. When you wash one dish, you are not just cleaning a piece of kitchenware. You are proving to yourself that action is possible. You are creating a micro moment of completion, of following through, of doing something instead of being paralyzed by the weight of everything that needs doing. When you walk for 5 minutes, you are not just moving your body. You are practicing the skill of starting, of overcoming inertia, of acting despite how you feel. These small completions accumulate. They build evidence. They create tiny cracks in the certainty that nothing you do matters. The key is to disconnect the action from the outcome, to stop requiring that each thing you do produce immediate results or dramatic change. You're not washing the dish to have a clean kitchen. You're washing the dish to practice agency. You're not going for a walk to get fit. You're going for a walk to demonstrate to yourself that your thoughts and feelings don't have to dictate your behavior. This is a subtle but crucial shift. When you attach your actions to big outcomes, depression can always point to how those outcomes haven't materialized yet and use that as evidence that trying is futile. But when the action itself is the point, when the victory is simply that you did something rather than nothing, depression has less room to maneuver. It can tell you that washing one dish didn't solve your problems, and you can agree with it. You can say, "You're right, it didn't, and I'm still going to wash another one tomorrow." Not because it solves everything, because it's something I can do right now, in this moment, regardless of how I feel or what I believe about myself. There's another crucial element of changing behavior that often gets overlooked, and it has to do with what you expose yourself to, what you allow into your experience. Depression thrives on isolation, on withdrawal, on cutting yourself off from anything that might contradict its narrative. And this often happens so gradually that you don't notice it occurring. You stop listening to music because nothing sounds good anymore. You stop going places because leaving the house feels like too much effort. You stop engaging with activities that used to bring you some measure of satisfaction because they don't bring satisfaction now, and depression says, "See, there's no point." But what's actually happening is that you're eliminating sources of potential positive experience before they have a chance to register. You're creating an environment so devoid of stimulation, of variety, of possibility, that of course everything feels flat and meaningless. And then you use that flatness as evidence that you're incapable of feeling anything good. The intervention here is not to wait until you want to do things. It's to do them anyway, to schedule them, to build them into your day as non-negotiable actions, regardless of whether you expect to enjoy them. You listen to music, not because you think it will make you feel better, but because you're creating an environment where feeling better becomes possible. You go outside not because you want to, but because you're exposing yourself to light, to movement, to the simple fact of being in a different space than the one you've been trapped in. You reach out to someone, not because you believe the conversation will be meaningful, but because you're practicing connection, because you're refusing to let depression make all your decisions for you. And what often happens, not always, but often enough to matter, is that you discover small moments of something other than numbness. A lyric that catches your attention. A change in temperature that feels pleasant against your skin. A sentence in a conversation that makes you forget for just a second how heavy everything feels. These moments don't fix you. They don't cure depression, but they create evidence that contradicts the absoluteness of depression's claims. They prove that not every moment is suffering, that not everything is pointless, that you are still capable of experiencing something other than despair. And here's what you need to know as we come to the end of this exploration. Change doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't happen because you finally understand what's wrong, or because you've had some revelation about your thought patterns. Change happens in the accumulation of small actions taken consistently over time, in the gradual building of evidence that runs counter to what depression has taught you to believe. It happens in the moments when you choose to act, despite the thoughts, despite the feelings, despite the absolute certainty that nothing will help. Every time you do this, every time you move even slightly toward engagement instead of withdrawal, toward action instead of paralysis, toward life instead of the slow erasure that depression offers, you are weakening the system. You are introducing chaos into a pattern that depends on predictability. You are becoming something other than what depression needs you to be. And eventually, if you keep doing this, if you keep choosing action over resignation, even when it feels absurd, even when it feels pointless, even when depression is screaming at you that you're wasting your time, something shifts. Not dramatically, not all at once, but you start to notice that the thoughts don't hit quite as hard. The predictions don't feel quite as certain. The future doesn't look quite as empty. And you realize that you've been building something this whole time, something fragile and tentative but real. You've been building a life that exists outside the story depression has been telling you. And that life, small as it might be right now, is the proof that everything you were told about yourself, about the world, about what's possible, was never as absolute as it seemed.